Well, this morning I want to talk about the strategic and ethical implications of deep nuclear cuts. And you'd think that this would actually be a pretty straightforward subject, that more nuclear weapons are immoral, fewer nuclear weapons are better, and that no nuclear weapons at all are the best. I tend to agree with that. Even though I come from a background in the policy community and spent a lot of years laboring in Washington, I fundamentally agree with the goal of the nuclear-free world and dramatic reductions in nuclear weapons. The question is how to get there, and to think about the kinds of arguments that are made against getting there, because I think as part of education and outreach and talking about reducing nuclear weapons, you really have to be hard-headed and to take on the hardest arguments that opponents of nuclear weapons will present to you. And this is one of them, particularly where they've shifted the argument, where folks who reject the idea of deep nuclear reductions have shifted the argument over to the ground of morality and ethics. And so I want to talk about that position, why it's a kind of a stopper issue in the short term that's preventing us from getting closer to the nuclear-free world that Dr. Akiba talked about last night, and give you a few thoughts on it. So part of it is an educational trip through how we got to where we are, and then some thoughts about perhaps how to break this logjam and move forward. First and most important thing to say is, even though I teach at the United States Naval War College, which is a senior graduate military school in Newport, Rhode Island, we have sister schools in Montgomery, Alabama with the Air Force, and Carlisle, Pennsylvania for the Army. I do not in any way represent the United States government or its policies or its opinion, or really represent any sane person, depending on who you ask, but certainly just speak for myself. And I don't represent either the government or the Carnegie Council or Harvard or anybody else that I'm affiliated with. With that said, let me move on. Except that my slides are gone. I see them down here. Oh. The old moving slide trick 99. Is there a way to lift those up a little bit, or no? Okay. Can everybody see those all right? The lower half's cut off? We're working on it. Keep going. Show must go on. Okay. Well, here's the deterrence dilemma. And the question since 1945, since the very first time that we, the United States, exploded a nuclear weapon, even as a test, even before the attacks on Japan, the question arose of, what is it that these weapons do? And I don't mean in terms of their physical effects, but rather, what are they supposed to do as an instrument of national security? Are they there to deter the use of other nuclear weapons? Do they solely have a deterrent purpose? Do they have a military use? Can they actually be used as an instrument of war? Or, as the great early thinker on nuclear strategy, Bernard Brodie, put it, do these weapons represent the end of strategy? In other words, are they so powerful, are they so destructive, are they so overwhelming that it's simply impossible to make strategy with anything this immensely destructive, that at some point you've gone beyond what the human mind can comprehend in terms of military conflict? The Western answer, that is to say the American and then British and French answer during the early period of NATO, was to try to capture all of that and to say, well, the answer is yes to all of the above. They're there to deter, nuclear weapons are there to deter the use of other nuclear weapons, but they also have a military use. And in fact, these two purposes are linked. Because you can argue that they have a military use, therefore the threat to use them is not crazy, therefore they could be used, which makes your enemy less likely to attack you, because you can make a credible case that you would actually use nuclear weapons, and that in the paradox, and remember, when we talk about nuclear weapons, we're through the looking glass, we're in the Alice in Wonderland world, that the willingness, the capability to use nuclear weapons actually means that you will end up being less likely to use nuclear weapons because your opponent will believe you. Okay? I'll leave time for Q&A at the end of this because I know all of this sounds somewhat odd. Back in 1980, when John Glenn was in the Senate and Secretary Harold Brown was Secretary of Defense, Senator Glenn said, you know, all of these things you're talking about, destroying cities, you know, I just get lost in what's credible and what's not credible. And Secretary Brown said, well, that's true, Senator, and that's why we all sound a little crazy when we talk about it. So this is all going to sound a little crazy when I talk about it. But again, my goal here is to take you through the evolution of this position and hopefully to help you understand why we're at the impasse that we're at now. And make no mistake, we are at an impasse. We are down to the point where we've negotiated a treaty with the Russian Federation to each have 1,550 active nuclear warheads. That number was arrived at based on an agreed ability to destroy between 100 and 150 urban areas in each country. That's progress. Remember that in 1967, the United States nuclear arsenal, today, the operational nuclear arsenal, this number used to be classified. The White House released it about a year and a half ago. Our operational nuclear arsenal is 5,113 weapons. That includes several thousand more in storage. By means of comparison, in 1967, that number was 32,000 nuclear weapons, with another 20,000 or so on the Russian side. So there has been progress, but that progress really has gone down to the ability to completely incinerate every square inch of the Earth to basically just kill everybody on the planet just a few times. Okay, so let me go back to the history of this deterrent dilemma. The initial problem was that Western policymakers were faced with an enemy in the Soviet Union and China, who at the time were allied, who vastly outnumbered the Western alliance. And just coming off of World War II, Europe down on its heels, only Great Britain with any military capacity left, the rest of the continent in Europe. There was simply no way that the United States or its allies could possibly think about confronting the Soviet Union or its allies all over the world. And so the answer at the time was massive retaliation, to take America's nuclear superiority and to say, look, we can't chase you all over the world. If you do something bad, we'll use nuclear weapons. And that was pretty much it. Now, this was not a strategy that lasted very long, and when I talk about this to my students, I usually avoid the word strategy. I say this isn't even a strategy. This was more of an act of desperation. This was a country, that the United States, that had just not even 10 years come out of World War II, found itself losing the peace, had just fought a war in Korea where nuclear weapons didn't seem to deter anybody's aggression. And so the idea here was to say, look, we can't fight you all over the world, but we have nuclear weapons, and they have some kind of use, but we're not quite sure what that is. All through this period, and you'll see that even to today, even in the 21st century, we still can't resolve this argument about what these weapons are for. Are they there as an insurance policy, or are they there as an actual weapon of war that you can actually use if things go bad? The Americans here, again, kind of split the difference. They said, if you communists do something bad, and we're not going to specify what bad is, just bad, then we'll do something with nuclear weapons at times and places of our own choosing. In other words, we're not going to fight you all over the world. At some point, you do something bad, we're going to use our nuclear advantage and punish you for what you've done. This was a hard strategy to make sense of, because for one thing, it only works if you're the only one with nuclear weapons. When you say, if you do something bad, we'll use nuclear weapons, it's not very helpful if the other guy can say, well, so will we. The other problem was we didn't quite explain what the trigger would be for using these weapons. We just said, look, we have them and we can use them and we will use them and we won't tell you how or why. And I always liken this, for those of you that are parents, I'm sure you've been through this with your children. You know, you're at the beach and you say to your kid, don't go in the water. Don't go in the water or you're going to be in a lot of trouble. And now you know where this is going. If you're a parent, you know where this is going. All right, don't go in past your ankles because we're going to have lunch soon. Look, just stay above your knees where I can see you. Don't get your bathing suit wet. All right, don't go, just keep it, all right, don't swim out too far. All right, come back for lunch. And the next thing you know, the child's paddling out there. Because you've said, don't go in the water or something bad will happen, but you haven't really defined that. And you know, the next thing you know, the child is paddling off to California. Well, the same thing here. You know, if you communists do something bad, we'll use nuclear weapons. Well, what is bad? Is it invading Europe? Yes, probably if you invade Europe and overrun NATO, we'll probably have to use nuclear weapons. But what if you don't do that? What if you just suppress a revolt in Hungary? Will that be enough? What if you support communist revolt in Indochina? Is that enough? You know, when does this trigger for nuclear use? When is that finally met so that you've met the test to say now you've done something so awful we can use nuclear weapons? And the fact of the matter is, the threat itself was not a moral threat. It was basically to say, if you do anything we don't like, we're going to incinerate millions of people for political reasons. Now, aside from the moral issue here of is it credible or is it moral to threaten mass death, indiscriminate mass death because of anything less than self-defense, there's a question here of whether or not it's credible. Because if you're making threats that are fundamentally immoral, are you not then making threats that are fundamentally incredible? You're asking your opponent to believe that you're so cold-blooded that you'll do exactly what you say, that you will shoot the hostage. And that's always a difficult position to be in, especially if you're a country whose values you have publicly put forward and defended as being Judeo-Christian values, that you respect life, that you try to adhere to the concepts and principles of medieval thinking about just war, and so on. And so it's very hard to suddenly adopt a position that says, well, I know we've said all that, but no, we're steely killers and we'll really do this. So aside from the fundamental moral problem of massive retaliation, it came under a huge amount of criticism for being non-credible, and that, in fact, the Soviet Union was not going to believe us, and that this made war more likely, and that the less your opponent believes you're willing to use nuclear weapons, the more they're willing to test you in other ways with conventional arms. And even before the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I think revealed the bankruptcy of nuclear threats, there was a similar problem here. A lot of events kind of put the lie to this problem of massive retaliation. And you can see as early as 1959, I reproduced this just as I don't obviously expect you to sit here and read your homework, but this is a declassified top secret document to the Secretary of State. And I put it up here because I wanted to make the point, as I often do with audiences that don't spend a lot of time working in Washington. Real people sat around really wrestling with this. These weren't abstract discussions that took place, you know, with a bunch of guys with patched elbows smoking pipes, you know, in a club somewhere in Washington. I mean, these were people every day writing memos of saying, you know, we have to abandon this idea of nuking the entire Soviet Union. We have to really question this strategy of deciding to launch all of our nuclear weapons at once. This was, what you're reading up there now was once one of the most highly classified documents in the United States government. But I put it up there to say, this is not hypothetical. These questions are not hypothetical. Real people struggled with this. And I think one thing I always put a plea in for is don't be too hard on the policymakers. They're people just like you. They've gone to Washington. They deal with things that you get to not have to think about every day. And believe me, you're happier for not having to think about them every day. I know this is the part that anytime anybody who's ever worked in the policy community says, oh, there are things you don't want to know. But believe me, there are things you don't want to know. I mean, it's just too disturbing because they're not resolvable. This is constantly trying to untie these horrendous knots of policy. Okay, so by the time of the Berlin crisis in 1961, here we have Checkpoint Charlie, Soviet and American tanks, nose to nose. This is even before the Cuban Missile Crisis. So much for nuclear weapons. We have this nuclear advantage. We've talked about how we'll use nuclear arms if we have to. And this doesn't seem to be stopping anybody from doing anything. As Secretary of State Rusk said at the time, when I go to bed at night, I try not to think about Berlin. It keeps me awake. Because if one side decides to test the other, in the end, someone's going to make a nuclear threat and have to carry out on it, and all of a sudden we're all living in a world that we didn't intend to be in. So, again, and I'm going through this history to kind of get to the question of how did we get addicted to this idea that the willingness to use nuclear weapons equals credibility, which in turn then equals peace. Because that, for those of us who are talking about a nuclear-free world and deep reductions, and when I say those of us, I mean everybody from the people in this room, our keynote speaker, Dr. Kiebit, all the way up to Henry Kissinger. No, I don't think anyone would accuse Henry Kissinger of being, a weak sister on national defense, or Bill Perry, or George Shultz. I mean, these are not people who tried to levitate the Pentagon in the 1960s. These are people who are inside the policy process for a long time. But when you're trying to get to that goal of bringing down nuclear weapons to very low levels, this is the history and the thinking about nuclear strategy that you're dealing with and that you're trying to overcome. And to understand how best to engage the people who disagree with you. Jim Kaysen is going to talk to you later on today, but Jim Kaysen and I had a discussion about this yesterday, saying that you have to make your arguments in a way that shows that you understand the arguments of the people who are disagreeing with you. It's not particularly useful or credible to simply say, well, my position is 0 because that's the morally coherent position and that's the end of it. That's a non-starter. You have to be able to argue from the historical and experiential ground that the people who disagree with you are coming from as well. So that's part of my goal this morning, is to give you some of that background, to arm you, to pardon the expression, arm you with those arguments. Well, the answer to this problem of mutual assured destruction and the incredible use of nuclear weapons was to come up with a whole notion of escalation. To say there's got to be something, maybe we can find some way to add something in between the complete use of nuclear weapons. I don't know if you remember, there was a wonderful movie, well, and I won't say that it was a fine work of cinema, but it was a funny movie with Bill Murray called Stripes in the 1980s. And until this point, our strategy had been the guy in the barracks who was kind of unhinged. He introduced himself and he said, "My name is Psycho." And he said, "My name's Francis, but if you call me Francis, I'll kill you. And if you touch any of my stuff, I'll kill you. And if you touch me, I'll kill you." Well, that was kind of our strategy up until, the early 1960s. If you do this, we'll kill you. If you did that, we'll kill you. If you call us Francis, we'll kill you. And the argument was, look, we're not deterring the Soviet Union by making those kinds of wild threats. We have to show them, where nuclear weapons are concerned, that we can get from peace to nuclear war, okay, in a way that makes sense. And that in fact, what we really want to show the Soviets is that if they start a war with us anywhere, they're going to force us to use nuclear weapons. They're going to back us into such a corner that we will have no choice but to climb this ladder of escalation where we start to mobilize forces, and we put our nuclear forces on ready alert, and then we fight in Europe, and then we get overrun in Europe, and then we might use battlefield nuclear weapons, and then we might use nuclear weapons at sea. And all of this was meant to convince the Soviet Union that if you start a war, we, the United States and NATO, we will have no choice but to eventually bring this all to Armageddon. And again, what's the paradox of nuclear deterrence? If you show that you're willing to engage in Armageddon, then you've made it clear to your opponent that there's no gain in war and that peace will be maintained. And this is the notion of peace through nuclear strength. Now, let me just say that during the Cold War, I didn't disagree with this approach because I thought of the Soviet regime as fundamentally crazy. I mean, I still think of the Soviet Union, the Soviet regime as at the end of its life in the 1970s and the 80s, as the Soviet Union was creaking towards its unlamented end. I thought of that regime as kind of mildly psychotic, and that if this is what it took to keep them from doing anything, then that's what it took. And international politics is not pretty. Sometimes the choices in foreign policy are between choices that are bad and other choices that are awful. You don't get a choice between a good choice and a bad choice. You get a choice between a bad choice and a worse choice. And you had people like Herman Kahn, a theorist, a man of great presence, as you can see there from his picture, who theorized about this. And he was the person who said, look, I understand this is disturbing, dark stuff to talk about, but you have to start thinking about a world in which you'd rather kill 40 million people instead of 100 million people. That was one of his famous quotes. And people found this shocking. They found it morally shocking. But Kahn's argument was, unless you're willing to talk about this, then you are ceding all of this to your opponent, who will simply believe that you are too weak and too scared to oppose you, and that will encourage them to do something dangerous, and then you'll find yourself using nuclear weapons even when you didn't want to. Now remember that the underlying assumption in all this in the 1950s and 60s and into the 1970s is nuclear weapons exist, we're not going to uninvent them, we're not going to go to zero, the Soviet Union is never going to give up theirs, so we have to live with the damn things, and so what are we going to do with them? The zero option, President Reagan is the first president who really proposes a serious zero option in 1981, and he's not taken seriously. As in the keynote you heard last night, he and President Reagan and General Secretary Gorbachev go to Reykjavik, nearly agree to denuclearize the world, and instantly panic everyone around them, including their own foreign secretaries. George Shultz tells a great story, and it just came out about a year ago. He talks about getting back from Reykjavik, and he got handbagged, to use his word, he got handbagged by Margaret Thatcher. He went to see, he got summoned to the Prime Minister, to the embassy, and Margaret Thatcher had her little purse, and she hit him with his purse. And she said, George, you know, what were you doing in Reykjavik? And he said, but Margaret, he's the president. And she said, but it's your job to keep him on the ground. And he said, but Margaret, I agree with him. And she kind of gave him a smack with her handbag. So it was only, you know, I think it's a good reminder that foreign policy is conducted by real people who, you know, eat breakfast and have families and, you know, need a good night's sleep just like the rest of us, and who, on occasion, when they lose their temper, whack each other with a handbag. For the record, I've never been handbagged by a world leader. But there's still time. All right. Now, the moral dilemma that arises by the end of the 1960s is we've established this notion that we will escalate, we'll climb this ladder, we're willing to fight, we're willing to engage in a nuclear conflict. But by 1967, both sides have so many weapons that the use of any appreciable number of nuclear weapons against each other will result in mutual and assured destruction. Now, the acronym is not accidental. Initially, this plan was called assured retaliation. That wasn't hip enough. Then it was assured destruction, and then someone in the policy community said, hey, why don't we call it mutual assured destruction, or MAD? There were even a couple of wags out there who said, well, this MAD says that you can never use nuclear weapons. Maybe we ought to have a separate theory called the nuclear utilization theory, which led to an argument called MAD versus nuts. I had nothing to do with it. But there's an important change here, and that is that the United States proposes, in effect, to the Soviet Union, look, let's realize the reality here. We're not going to do civil defenses. We're not going to try and put up missile defenses. In effect, what we have here is a mutual suicide pact. Henry Kissinger described it as two scorpions in a bottle. Stuck, and if you shake the bottle, they'll sting each other to death, and that's it. Even Kissinger, who was known to be the architect of much of the late 60s and early 70s nuclear strategy in the United States, once said, look, if the only option you have is killing 80 million people, that is the height of immorality. And this, I think, again, to be fair to people who have been vilified for their conduct of other foreign policies, George Shultz, Bill Perry, Sam Nunn, Henry Kissinger, clearly this nuclear issue bothered them. It bothered their consciences even during the Cold War, but I think they tamped down a lot of that concern because of the threat of a war with the Soviet Union. And they were doing the best they could to try to figure out how to keep the peace with a regime that was simply not reasonable and not easily reasoned with. Kissinger, this was a famous metaphor of, we are scorpions in a body, that remarkable voice that he has. My favorite Kissinger line, former Defense Secretary Gates once gave a talk where he said that his favorite Kissinger line was that he is rumored, and again, all stories about Henry Kissinger are apocryphal, but Kissinger is rumored to have said, I am not as smart as God, but I am as smart as God was when he was my age. So I use that one on my students all the time. They say, Professor, do you not know that? And I say, hey, I'm not as smart as God. But, and so Secretary McNamara takes this forward to Congress, and Congress is very skeptical. Congress, wants to defend the American people. They want to build defenses. They are unsure of the Johnson administration's foreign policy with regard to the Soviet Union. And McNamara quite famously says to Congress, look, they know that if they strike us first, we'll destroy 120 million of them. This is a rejection of the military use of nuclear weapons. So look, if you do this, we'll take you with us. Now, the problem is, you're back to the massive retaliation argument. How do you make that credible? How do you say to somebody, we'll kill 120 million of you? Because, again, the Soviets would say, no, you won't. You're Americans. You don't do that. You don't do mass murder. And so what we did was to say, no, we'll do it because we have military targets that will strike. We won't just flatten the Soviet Union. We will try to destroy military assets and fight this like a regular war. And that was something that we believed, I think correctly, that the Soviets would believe, because the Soviets thought that way. They tended to think of nuclear weapons as kind of big bombs. Now, increasingly, it turns out the Soviets were having the same fears we were, they just wouldn't tell us. Because again, they didn't want to be perceived as weak in front of us. But that's where we are as we head into the 1970s. And the 1970s are a very difficult time where there is this stability between the superpowers where we both agree we're not going to attack each other. Nuclear war would be too terrible. Well, except that frees the Soviets in particular to say, well, now that we don't have to worry about nuclear war, we're going to send our forces into Africa and Southeast Asia and Afghanistan and all kinds of other places. And this ends up creating some real headaches for American foreign policy, particularly for Jimmy Carter, who comes into office in 1976, and he says that Americans, if you'll pardon my Jimmy Carter impression, he said, Americans have an inordinate fear of communism. That we have an inordinate fear of communism. We don't need all these nuclear weapons. In fact, Carter at one point, while he's being briefed as president-elect, says, why don't we just knock all these weapons down to 300 and put them all in submarines? And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, by this report, looked at him and was just speechless. Because there was simply no way we were ever going to negotiate that with the Soviet Union in its current condition. Carter learned some very hard lessons about what it's like to deal with a communist superpower in full flower, feeling at the height of its powers. And by 1978, he makes a turn rightward. Now, I can tell you that I've been told by people that know President Carter that he hates this comparison. He doesn't like to be compared to Ronald Reagan. All I can say is, I'm sorry, Governor Carter, that's just the way it goes, especially because the Soviets in later years admitted, many of them admitted in their memoir materials, that by 1980, they found Carter so bellicose, they were actually hoping Ronald Reagan would win the election. They thought that Reagan would be another Nixon, who talked the talk, but then wheeled and dealed on nuclear weapons. The problem for Carter is that he, too, was trying to get out from under this notion that any use of nuclear weapons is inherently incredible. And so he starts to abandon mutual assured destruction. He creates this strategy called Presidential Directive 59, and he says, what does the Soviet Union really value? And this matters because this is coming back to haunt us now as we're talking about North Korea and Iran, okay? What does the Soviet Union really value? Does it value the lives of its own citizens? Well, clearly not. They kill their own citizens with reckless abandon, and they seem more than happy to do it. What they really value is their political control, the Communist Party's political control over Eurasia. And so the United States puts out a new targeting strategy that says, we're not going to go after people, we're going to go after things like the KGB and the Communist Party headquarters and railways and nuclear missiles and military concentrations. Well, of course, the problem is striking all those things. It's like saying we're not after the people in the United States. We're just going to blow up we're going to nuke every FBI headquarter in the United States. Well, the fact that they're all located downtown presents something of a problem. And these limited strikes would virtually have destroyed the entire USSR, and the Soviets were apoplectic about this. They said, Jimmy Carter, who's for 4 years has been doing nothing but stripping the bark off us about our human rights issues, has now created a nuclear war plan and approved programs. And I think it's important to point out, Jimmy Carter is the person who approved programs like the MX missile, the new Trident submarine, the stealth bomber, all programs that Ronald Reagan was more than happy to pick up and run with. But by 1980, as far as the Soviets are concerned, there's very little difference between Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan in foreign policy and certainly in nuclear strategy. And even before Reagan comes in, the Soviets are moving toward a war footing. And we're entering a very dangerous period into the early 1980s where the Soviet Union is getting ready to look for signs of imminent nuclear strike. And we've tried to convince them to behave themselves by convincing them that we're actually willing to use nuclear weapons. Well, the problem is they're believing us now, and they're acting accordingly. So the situation at the end of the Cold War is that we've created a situation of deterrence that weds mutual assured destruction to a policy or a strategy of war fighting that says, we won't just kill everybody in Russia, we'll do it in some militarily meaningful way. I know that sounds ridiculous, but think about the logic behind it. It's trying to convince your opponent that, no, I'm not just going to inflict mass death on you. I'm actually going to fight in some way that makes sense. And if it happens to kill everybody in your country, well, that's the way it goes. But you, the Soviets, you will have forced me to do this. And that was the most powerful argument, was to say, you Soviets, you will force us into doing this. We will have no choice. We'll be losing. I mean, we used to say to them, if you attack us, in Europe especially, we'll lose. And we'll have no choice but to do this. So don't attack us. Don't put us in that corner. and that we were targeting the Soviet Union in escalating layers, that, well, things would happen in Europe, we would use weapons on the battlefield, Hiroshima-sized weapons, small in nuclear terms always being relative, but small compared to weapons that destroy entire cities. Then we would target their nuclear forces before they could reach us. Then if we had to, we would destroy their command and control facilities, including their leadership if we could find them. If we had to, as a last resort, we would attack their cities to prevent them from recovering, to destroy their industries or their agriculture or their chemical or energy or other forms of infrastructure. And there you're really talking about Armageddon. And we knew it, and they knew it. But this was out of control. By 1990, there's a great story. Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney, and I don't think anybody's going to argue that Dick Cheney is a weak-kneed or easily frightened person. Dick Cheney is getting his briefing on the nuclear war plan, and they're pointing out to him that, well, okay, here's our plan. We have 500 warheads targeted against Moscow. And a radar installation to the north of Moscow. Radar installations, by the way, are considered very soft targets that, you really only have to hit them once or twice, and because they're all sitting above ground, they melt and they're gone and it's over. Well, up there we have 67 warheads targeted against that radar installation. So we're looking at thousands of warheads being targeted against thousands of targets. And even Dick Cheney says, what are you doing? What is this plan? This doesn't make any sense. And every American president, from even from Eisenhower once said, listen, if we ever use more than 10 of these things, I'm going to Argentina. John F. Kennedy got his briefing like this, and he walked out and shook his head and said, and we call ourselves the human race. President Nixon, after he came into office in '69, constantly pressured the Joint Chiefs. He said, I want a plan that does not kill everybody in the world. And on and on and on. Every president, Reagan famously fell asleep during his briefing, and people took that as, oh, the old man, he's out of it. The reason Reagan fell asleep during his briefing is he thought it was so irrelevant that he had no interest in it. They were showing him how to launch nuclear weapons, and he went, yeah, that's fine. This is not something I'm ever going to do. So, you boys talk. I'm going to catch up on a little catnap here. And in fact, before his death, Paul Nitze, who was Reagan's top advisor, said, now at that point Reagan was already dead and Nitze was near the end of his life, and he said, I advised President Reagan never to use nuclear weapons, even in retaliation, even if the United States were struck first. But again, the kind of thing you didn't want to say out loud during the Cold War because you didn't want to communicate that to the Soviet Union. But it shows you that even the people doing this understood what a paradoxical and, in some ways, irrational game that they were playing. Our current policy is one that is called ambiguity, by us and by our enemies. We call it calculated ambiguity. We tell smaller countries that if they use nuclear weapons against us, that we will do something bad. And it might be nuclear. It might not be, but it could be. But maybe we won't. But we can. But we're not telling you. Except if we threaten it, which we won't, unless we have to. Again, have some mercy on the people who make policy. You don't want to be in a situation where you say to the Iranians or the North Koreans, if you use nuclear weapons, we will nuke you. I mean, what's the target set for nuking North Korea? I would imagine the Japanese and the Chinese and the Russians and all the other people who are going to be covered by that fallout are going to have some serious objections to responding to anything going on in Korea with 4 or 5 or 6 nuclear strikes. We, Americans, talk about it very easily. I mean, I find very often my students, people in the intelligence, military community say, well, if the North Koreans use nuclear weapons, we'll just use them too. That's easy to say. It's a lot more difficult to do. Especially when you're talking about a country of 22 million starving people that have no real military assets worth striking. The Obama administration tried to review its nuclear policy in 2010, And just like the Bush nuclear policy review in 2002 and the Clinton nuclear policy in 1994, it remarkably came to the stunning conclusion that the status quo was just fine, maybe smaller. Maybe the status quo only smaller. We still need a triad. We still need bombers, missiles, submarines. We still need to have, and this is the key I want to get to today, we still need to have a mutual assured destruction capability. We still need to be able to fight a nuclear war. And that's no matter who's reelected or elected, that's not going to change. You are not, if President Obama has another 4 years in office, I made a prediction before the third foreign policy debate. I said there will not be 2 feet of substantive daylight between the candidates on foreign policy. And I think I was proven correct on this. Because, look, again, it's partly because Americans don't care about foreign policy and they don't want to hear about it, which is our fault. We have to take the blame where it's due. Americans, when the president or Governor Romney goes to a shopping mall in Ohio or Pennsylvania or Indiana, no one wants to hear about the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. No one cares, okay? They don't understand it. They don't want to hear about it. They want to hear about jobs and the economy, and that's understandable. Those are the things that have a direct impact on their life. I would argue that the use of a nuclear weapon will also have a fairly significant impact on their life. But, excuse me. But on the other hand, I also think that presidents tend to be remarkably alike in foreign policy because no matter what you say on the campaign trail, when you finally go to the Oval Office and they hand you your first day of the president's briefing book and you open it up and you go, oh no, I didn't know any of this stuff. And I wish I hadn't said all that other stuff. And it always happens, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. You say things on the campaign trail, and then you sit in the Oval Office, and everybody comes in and says, all right, well, here's what's really going on in the world. And you go, oh, boy, I had no idea it was this complicated. So I don't expect that to change much. On the other hand, the good news is this. I mean, since the end of the Cold War, the number of nuclear weapons has been dropping dramatically. Now, some of this is because nuclear weapons are more accurate and you need fewer of them. Targets that you needed 10 weapons to destroy, you now just need 2. Nonetheless, anything that takes the number down from a lot to fewer is probably a good trend. And I think this is, again, one of those things that people kind of don't think about or don't believe, to say, no, we've really slashed the nuclear inventory. And we did it, in a lot of cases, unilaterally. I think one of the things that the first President Bush didn't get a lot of credit for was, as the Soviet Union was falling, President George H.W. Bush, just with the stroke of a pen, eliminated entire chunks of the nuclear inventory. He denuclearized the surface Navy. He took a lot of weapons off alert. I mean, it can be done if a president has the political capital to do it. Now, I don't think that President Obama has the political capital to do it. I don't think a President-elect Romney will have the political capital to do it. President Bush occupied a very fortunate moment in history where Gorbachev was in charge of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was falling apart, and the president could kind of run through that opening and say, in that way he did, in that calm way. I actually saw President Bush one time. I loved the first President Bush, and I just think he's one of the greatest. I really admire him as a president because I think he's not gotten the credit that he should get for the careful handling of the end of the Cold War. But it was disconcerting to watch him speak. I actually saw him once say, I want to bring people together, not... he said, I want to bring people together, not push them apart. And I thought I was watching I thought maybe the dubbing on my, the voiceover was wrong or something. But he meant well and he did well, and I think that's important. And I think that graph, when I was a young man, younger, studying this stuff back in the mid-1980s, I didn't think I was going to live long enough to see this kind of graph. I just didn't think that was possible. So I'm an optimist. I'm already living in a world that I didn't think was possible. And I was very glad that last night we were told many times, this is the most peaceful world we've ever lived in. The world is not such a bad place in the 21st century. but it could be a lot better, and it could be a lot safer. And a lot of people are dying needlessly, and at a time when I think it's even more preventable, which makes those deaths even more of a tragedy. All right, let me get to the meat of this argument about the immorality of fewer weapons so that I can leave a few minutes for questions. The argument, and this is a very clever argument, has been made by the head of the Air Force Association, Lieutenant General Dunn, who said, well, you know, if we get down to very few nuclear weapons, we can't do any of that military targeting anymore. We're going to have to target cities. And that's immoral. I mean, for an Air Force general to flip this around on everybody and say, oh, you know, I'm really concerned about the morality of this, what is really a remarkable, a very clever kind of rhetorical maneuver that throws the moral burden back on the arms reduction advocates. Because what Dunn is saying is, look, if you give me a lot of nuclear weapons, I have options. And I can tell the president, listen, I can strike rail yards, I can strike energy, I can strike shipyards, I can strike the enemy's nuclear weapons. I can do a lot of things before I just have to start dropping bombs in the middle of Beijing or Moscow or Pyongyang or wherever it is. Okay? Does everybody follow the logic of that? To say, if I have more nuclear weapons, I can hit things that are less important than cities. But if you limit me down to a couple of hundred nuclear weapons, the only way I can deter the enemy is to threaten to kill his population. And that is immoral. It's a very powerful argument. And in fact, in 2000, when George W. Bush came in, he, like every president before him, got the brief about nuclear weapons, and he turned to his advisors and he said, what do we need all these nuclear weapons for? These are ridiculous. You know, let's get rid of them. And at the time, you know, his advisors, including the military, said, well, Mr. President, you cut that down, you're going to have to tell the Russians that you're targeting their cities. And you know, do you really want to disrupt our relationship with the Russians by saying that? Well, you know, and Bush said, well, I don't want to do that. That's immoral. Well, the problem is, the idea under it is that the military choices that you have, if you have a lot of nuclear weapons, are more ethical than just hitting cities. It totally ignores, it's almost an approach that's right out of the 1950s when the world was a lot more sparsely populated. That you can hit other targets and you're really not going to kill a lot of people. And this has been pushed by younger scholars who I think don't have a very good understanding of how all this works. There have been a couple of guys that have been doing work, for example, that have said the United States, if it uses very small nuclear weapons, can wipe out the entire Chinese nuclear force and only kill 700 people. Now, they claim they have a model where that works. My answer is, when you're in a nuclear crisis with the Chinese, presidents don't call up young college professors with models and graphs. Because if you're wrong, and it's a lot more than 700 people, then you're going to have a nuclear war on your hands. But there are people who argue that it can be done. The other is that you need to keep a lot of these weapons because that's what keeps the enemy deterred. And that if you make any other threat, including city attacks, you really are offending God and man to target innocent civilians. And that you're back in the situation of, this is why I took you through massive retaliation. You're back to that situation where you're just making wildly immoral and therefore wildly uncredible, non-credible threats. And you're actually going to endanger our security because potential enemies simply aren't going to believe us that we're willing to do that. Well, I would argue that this is just riddled with fallacies. It's a very powerful argument at the outset, and it certainly makes it sound like, wow, I guess we're just stuck with all these nuclear weapons, and we're stuck with targeting for mutual assured destruction, and we're stuck with military targeting. I would argue that the first fallacy is there's no way to tell the difference between targeting cities and targeting anything else. The Pentagon, last I checked, is right next to Washington, D.C. If you hit the Pentagon, you don't attach a note to it that says, now please don't engage in a full-scale nuclear war. We were only aiming at the Virginia suburbs where the Pentagon is. I know we killed everything else in the Beltway, but it was really just the Pentagon. The problem is that most of the targets, this is a problem that in the nuclear speak, and this gets into the nuclear theology that people like Jim and I have had to study for years, it becomes its own language. This is the problem of co-location. The things that you care about tend to be located in places that you care about. This whole argument would be a great argument if all our military bases were on the moon, okay? But they're not. They're spread out. They're in places like, one of the big targets was Whiteman Air Force Base right here in this state. There was no way that you were going to attack that Air Force Base and say, oh, sorry, St. Louis, it wasn't about you. And the same thing with the Russians. The Russians have all of their nuclear forces spread out through European Russia and close to their cities. There's no way to attack those forces without killing millions of people. The Chinese have a very small force. It sits in a very isolated area. But I tend to agree with the people who've looked at this from other organizations like the Federation of American Scientists, and I never thought I'd be quoting those guys. Like the arms controllers who know that I used to work for the Republicans in the Senate, are laughing now and saying this is the ultimate karmic payback to somebody like me. But I tend to agree with their estimates that even a small attack on China, you're talking 2 million people. You're not going to lose 2 million people and not fight back. A limited attack on the United States is anywhere from 4 to 8 million people killed. And we're talking millions. We're talking, the United States lost 460,000 people in World War II, and now we're talking about losing 4 million in 28 minutes. It's simply not credible. Yeah, it's true that you could attack certain forms of infrastructure. You could use nuclear weapons to knock out the power grid or the energy grid. But the fact of the matter is, you're still going to create casualties beyond all reckoning. I always point out to my students, my younger students, the burns alone. The United States has approximately 1,800 burn beds. That is, say, medical facilities, special beds for people who've suffered terrible burns. We have 1,800 of them in the whole country. There was a fire at a nightclub near where I live in Rhode Island that filled up every available burn resource in all 6 New England states and eastern New York. And that was just a nightclub fire. It used every medical evac helicopter, the entire burn unit at Mass General Hospital. The doctors were literally fainting in the hallways from overwork. Okay? Now, multiply that times 10,000 burn casualties. There aren't enough medical resources in the world to handle even the limited casualties that would come from this. And I don't think and now this gets to a political problem. There's no way for a country to distinguish a limited attack when it's coming in on the radar. This is the kind of thing that game theorists and modelers and people who play with numbers come up with. But in the United States, for example, we have 450 land-based missiles. We used to have 1,000. Well, if you take the standard wargaming rule of 2 warheads per target, because you always assume one of them malfunctions. So you launch, you're saying, I'm just attacking the American nuclear, I'm just going to knock out the land-based American nuclear force. So I've only launched 1,000 nuclear warheads against you. That's just a limited attack. Let's not go crazy. Well, the president is not going to, they're going to be hustling the president to a waiting helicopter, screaming in his ear, and he's going to say, how many? And they're going to say 1,000, and he's not going to say, wait, 1,000? Oh, for a minute I thought it was going to be bad. There is no way to distinguish those kinds of attacks. These are the models that academics and war gamers play with. This is not the way real decision makers or real policymakers think about things. And I would argue that the position of people like General Dunn is a red herring. And in fact, every time we've reduced nuclear weapons from the 1980s onward, we always get this argument. All right, we're going down to 6,000 back in 19. We're going down to 6,000, and the arms control opponents say, "That's it. That's as low. Below that, boy, we are talking serious danger to our security." And then we go down to 3,000. Wow, all right, we've hit the floor. All right, we're going to go to 2,200 in the Moscow Treaty under George Bush. All right, 2,200, but any lower than that, and we are talking the end of the American way of life. All right, how about 1,500 in the START Treaty? Yeah, we can deal with that, but I swear, any lower than that, and it's just, it never stops. I mean, every time we get to a lower number, we're told that this is the lowest possible number that there can be. Now, I would love to see a world where no one has nuclear weapons. I am also a grown-up, and I understand that that's not going to happen. Certainly not going to happen in my lifetime. It's not going to happen in yours. You're not going to disinvent the technology. You might as well try to uninvent telephones or the internal combustion engine. It's not going to happen. However, I do think if we can break ourselves of this addiction to the notion that we can fight wars, that in order to be credible as a deterrent, that we have to be able to fight wars with nuclear weapons. If we can get past that, we can start getting down to very low numbers. Because I agree with the principle that nuclear weapons, by their very nature, are immoral. They are contrary to the law of war. Even small nuclear weapons, which have the same effects as conventional arms, leave horrendously toxic, as we know, as we're going to be told about. I mean, they leave lasting impacts for generations that ripple through our bodies, our genetic code, our culture for years on end. But we are stuck with them. Again, this is this is where we have to come back to reality and say, we are stuck with them, and we're stuck with them for a while. So how do we target them? How do we do this and keep the peace and still make the effective argument to the policy community that we can go lower than the planet-destroying levels of nuclear weapons that they have? So this is my proposal, which I'll end up with. I argue that the United States should simply declare that the only purpose of our weapons is to defend the actual existence of the United States. That if a country threatens us and says, we're going to nuke your country and take you off the map, that we can say, look, then no, you can't, because you can't win. We have enough to defend ourselves, and you'll go with us. I don't know that I would engage in that retaliation. I would like to think that I too am a Christian, and I would like to think that I would be strong enough to say, no, I would never do it. But I do think you have to have the option to say to people who may be crazy, look, I am not unarmed. Second, I think that the United States, long overdue, should simply declare that it will never be the first to use nuclear weapons. It's not hard to do. And, not to sound cynical about it, but if situations change and somehow, we have Russian and Chinese paratroopers reenacting Red Dawn and jumping into Detroit and Seattle, maybe we can rethink that policy. But until then, I think we're pretty safe in saying we don't need to use nuclear weapons first. We're the most powerful military, NATO and the United States, the most powerful military force conventionally that has ever existed in the history of mankind. I think we can take care of ourselves. I would also argue that the notion here of keeping some small nuclear arsenal is purely to deny the notion of any meaningful victory to the opponent. If someone says, well, we're going to strike you with 25 weapons and take you out of the international game, to say, look, we can retaliate in kind and take us both out of the game and give the rest of the world a chance. Again, I don't like it. I don't think it's a moral position, but I also take the world as it is rather than as I want it to be at the current moment. I think this is achievable with a force of perhaps as low as 300. Some of my colleagues at the Air Force War College have come up with 311. I actually called one of them and I said, what's with the extra 11? And they said, well, it's because of the number of bombers and ships. And they said, we just came up with that number. But roughly 300, maybe even less. Remove all these weapons from high alert. No one's going to surprise attack us. But they don't need to be ready to go at a moment's notice. I think we ought to keep a large number of weapons actually in the United States. And there's a kind of twisted reason for that I think makes sense. You don't want to put all your bombers out, or weapons out to sea, because then you may well encourage somebody to say, well, if I can get rid of all American nuclear weapons by fighting out on the oceans, that's great. Maybe I should try it. I think you should have to, if you're going to really think about attacking the United States with nuclear weapons, you should have to think about attacking the central United States. Because then, that's the only credible scenario under which a president says, now you've really pushed me into a corner. I know that sounds like a dangerous game of chicken, but we are dealing in the world with very dangerous and sometimes irrational people. And I think that means keeping at least 3 submarines. This is the British model. The British keep 3 submarines on station. You know, they say, look, one British submarine with 72 nuclear warheads on is more than enough to pretty much, you know, induce anybody to behave. 72 nuclear weapons enough to destroy any country in the world. Excuse me, in the world. But the overarching declaration should be, these weapons have no purpose other than to deter the use of similar weapons against us, period. And we will never use them first. Now, the Obama Defense Review in 2010 came this close to saying it, and then it backed away, and they split the difference, and they basically took the same deterrent position that Bush 1 had, and Clinton had, and Bush 2, and they said, well, we really wish the world were like that, so that we could just say, all we want these weapons for is deterrence. But we have to maintain the option to use them for military purposes. And of course, that opens the door for a lot of America's opponents to say, aha, so they really are up to no good. And I thought it was unfortunate. I was hoping to see a much, I think the 2010 nuclear review, like the ones before it, and I say this in a bipartisan way, none of them said anything of consequence, unfortunately. They are products of the bureaucracy, and they read like it. So, in the end, deterrence is still a necessity, but the strategy of MAD is not. Our current nuclear thinking is mired in a Cold War model of deterrence. We can't seem to let go of it. The Cold War was 20 years ago, and during the debates, you saw President Obama zing Governor Romney about this. But to me, that was, you know, a pot and kettle situation, because the Obama administration has held on to a traditional Cold War nuclear structure that he inherited from Bush, and that Bush inherited from Clinton, and Clinton inherited from Bush and Reagan. The president has not changed our nuclear posture in any significant way. And to say that Mitt Romney is holding on to the Cold War, they all are. The whole infrastructure is still stuck by inertia. I have a European colleague who calls this nuclear inertia, and they're both stuck in it, and it's not going anywhere. In part because during elections like this, where the economy is a huge factor, nobody cares about this. Nobody thinks about it, unfortunately. However, I will say the one change that should be made for both parties is to stop paying attention to Russia. We keep talking about, well, what are the Russians doing? And how many missiles do they have? Who cares how many Russian missiles there are? They're not going to, you know, wake up one morning and say, aha, we have 10 more missiles than the Americans today. It's go time. It's not going to happen. It wasn't going to happen during the Cold War. Putin he takes these dramatic pictures primarily for his own internal consumption, to show his own population that he's a tough guy. It takes their mind off the fact that he can't adequately feed them and hasn't built them enough hospitals, and, you know, can't get the potholes fixed. We really have to stop, you know, linking our arms control efforts to staying in lockstep with the Russians. That is a very Cold War mentality, and it's a bipartisan one. It doesn't matter who's in office. We always start by saying, well, what are the Russians doing? And I think that just gets us nowhere, because the Russians are not very productive on this, and it's time to just ignore them. We're stronger than that. We're a stronger, more capable country than that. We don't need to ask the Russians if it's okay with them if we reduce our own nuclear weapons. Finally, nuclear deterrence is a moral horror. But the way out of it is not to keep indulging this fantasy that we can deter enemies by having, by engaging in military uses of nuclear arms. If we must live with nuclear weapons, and for the time we must, the way to get to far lower levels is to reserve them for the ultimate protection of the United States from existential threats. In other words, purely for the self-defense of the survival of our country if threatened with a major nuclear attack from a peer like Russia or China. All other dangers, and I include in this North Korea and Iran, even if they develop nuclear weapons, all of those dangers can be dealt with through our conventional forces. We talk about our army being overstretched and we don't have enough money. To me, that is a ridiculous argument. NATO has 28 countries in it. It represents 500 billion people. It's got the top 12 most productive economies in it. There is no threat in the world that NATO cannot handle if it has the will and is willing to spend the money on conventional weapons. We don't need to keep relying on the nuclear crutch. But the first step to get down to that lower level is to get away from this mutual assured destruction, Cold War mentality that like a zombie, we were talking last night about zombies, like a zombie just keeps getting back up every time we knock it down and just keeps the nuclear enterprise in the United States and the Russian Federation locked right where they were sometime around the 1980s. And that we can do something about.